Hi guys and welcome to this session by Intellipaat. So we live in a data-driven world. There's huge chunks of information everywhere, and as a result there's a huge demand for data engineers. And so today we have come up with this session on interview questions for data engineering so that you can be prepared for your next interview. But before we get into all of that, please subscribe to our channel to never miss an update from Intellipaat. Now, without wasting any further time, let's just get into the session.
Well, we already know that the data engineer's role is one of the top roles to have in this particular decade. With that comes a lot of competition, and where it creates a demand where people are looking for the most proficient data engineers they can find. And this ensures that there are a lot of job openings, which again equate to more interviews and more chances of you guys landing the dream job as data engineers. Well, without further ado, let's begin with this compilation of the top 50 questions that have the highest probability of occurrence in an interview, and you can use this to ace all of your interviews. The questions and answers are both precise and at the same time descriptive enough to help you to add on your own points to the answers as well as answer them to the best of your abilities. So with this guide, we are sure that you can answer all of the high probability occurrence questions in the interview and eventually impress the interviewer and land those jobs. Well, let us begin. Question number 1. What is data engineering? Well, data engineering is a method, it's a technique, and in fact it's a job role where a person is proficient enough to handle the data and work with data in terms of storing it and converting raw data into useful information. So data engineer is a person who has the ability to maintain the data in the system, work with the data, and eventually store it after the data processing has been done. So coming to the next question, what is data modeling? Well, data modeling is a very simple step of simplifying an entity. Here in the concept of data engineering, you will be simplifying a complex software by simply breaking it up into diagrams. When you think about diagrams in data modeling, think about flowcharts, because flowcharts are a simple representation of how a complex entity can be broken down into a simple diagram. So this will basically give you a visual representation and easier understanding of the complex problem and even better readability to a person who might not be proficient in that particular software usage as well. Coming to the next question, what are the design schemas that are used when performing data modeling? Well, mainly there are two schemas that you must understand when you're learning about data engineering. It's the star schema and the snowflake schema. With the star schema, basically data is spread out in the structure of a star where you have one primary table in the middle and all of the other tables surrounding it are trickled down from the main table. When we have to talk about the snowflake schema will consider a main fact table and multiple dimensional tables, which will again have subtables, as you can see on the right hand side of your screen. So you have one fact table, you have a couple of dimensional tables, and these individual dimension tables can again have n number of subtables as well. So looking at it in a perspective, a star schema is very simple to implement, but then a snowflake schema is more efficient and it will have a better amount of usage in terms of efficiency and responsiveness, which we will be checking out in the next couple of questions. This brings us to the fourth question. What are the differences between structured and unstructured data? Well, we can compare four very important parameters when we are answering this question. So whenever you're talking about structured data, make sure you visualize an Excel workbook, because this will give you an understanding that your data is sorted into rows and columns. It is sorted based on some factors. So that makes the primary difference between a structured piece of data and an unstructured piece of data. A quick example can be a data set, as I mentioned, for the structured data, and it can be any sort of images, videos, or unorganized data in a text file, which can be unstructured as well. When we're talking about how these data is stored, coming to the first point, storage methodologies, we'll be using a database management system to analyze, maintain, and work with a database. to work with a structured database. When it is unstructured data, most of the storage methodologies will depend on that particular application, and it goes unmanaged in many of the cases as well. There are a couple of protocol standards that you must know. We have ODBC, we have the SQL and ADO.NET for structured data, and we have the XML, CSV, SMTP and SMSM standards for the unstructured data handling aspect as well. When you're talking about scaling the schemas, be it the star schema or even the snowflake schema, in terms of structured data, making your schema into a more expansive state, or expanding on the existing schema will be very difficult in terms of structured data. But then if you have unstructured data, you can convert them into schemas very efficiently and quickly and work with it easily as well. So these form some of the vital differences between structured and unstructured data. Coming to the next question. Hadoop is a very important part of a data engineer's role. So understanding all of the tools that come along with Hadoop and in the Apache ecosystem will add a lot of weightage to your candidature. So it is fitting that question number 5 is, what is Hadoop? Well, Hadoop is one of the world's most used framework today for handling big data. Hence, it is called as the gold standard of big data. It is basically an open source framework that is used to perform all sorts of activities such as data manipulation, data storage. It has its own file storage methodologies, and it runs on entities called as clusters. We'll be checking out a bit about this in the next set of questions as well. With that note, moving on to the next question. Question number 6. What are the important components of Hadoop? Well, there are multiple components that you can quote at this point of time, but the 4 most important concepts that you have to tell out is these. The first component is Hadoop Common. Well, Hadoop Common is this very important component of Hadoop, which basically consists of all of the utilities, all of the tools, all of the libraries and sub-frameworks that you'll be using in the Hadoop application. This is very important. And the second thing is Hadoop File System, or as it's called, HDFS. So what HDFS does is it basically provides a distributed file system which will give the application and the server client architecture a high amount of bandwidth where, with respect to big data, you can transfer a lot of data at any given moment, and HDFS provides this advantage to Hadoop users. So coming to Hadoop Yarn, Yarn stands for yet another resource negotiator, and it is basically a very beautifully put together tool which is used to manage all of the resources whenever you work with a Hadoop application. So basically, Yarn provides a resource negotiator, which in turn is a simple scheduler. So these set of scheduling operations will add to the advantages and the efficiency of the system as well. And the fourth and the last important component is the Hadoop MapReduce. MapReduce is a technique which is being implemented everywhere ever since the launch of Hadoop. So with MapReduce, users can have access to a large scale of data and process it very effectively by making use of these 2 functions, one being the map function, the other one being the reduction function. So these form to be the very important components of Hadoop. Of course, you can add on more components in case if the interviewer is expecting you to know more. In this particular case, make sure that you can emphasize on the other components which Hadoop provides as well. This brings us to the next question. What is a NameNode in HDFS? Well, do understand this. NameNode is one of the very, very important aspects of HDFS, which is mostly asked in all of the interviews, because NameNode is an entity in Hadoop which consists of all of the metadata of the actual storage files. What you need to understand is that when you're talking about NameNode, the actual data gets stored in the data nodes. There's another entity called as DataNode, and the data gets stored there. But the reference to those data nodes and all of the metadata which describes the actual data is present in the NameNode. And this brings us to the next question, which is, what is Hadoop streaming? Well, Hadoop streaming is a very beautifully put together utility which is provided by Hadoop to the users in case if there is a requirement for the users to go on to map operations and work with reduction operations at the same time as well. So basically, by performing mapping operations and reduction operations, the user has full ability and flexibility to work with with the data and process it in a simplified manner. And this is basically used later to submit it to one cluster where it can be put to use after processing. So this is the state in between where the data is converted from its raw entity into information, and later where data is actually put into use to drive some sort of analytics. Question number 9. What are some of the important features of Hadoop? Well, the first most feature you need to talk about is how it is open source. Since it is open source, it has a community of millions of people across the globe where there are a lot of contributions, lot of revisions, making the tool more effective and easy to use with every iteration and release. And Hadoop works on the basis of distributed computing, parallel processing, and you have to talk about data redundancy a bit. So since Hadoop works on the basis of distributed computing, your data is spread across multiple machines. And what if a machine fails? Is your data lost? Well, the answer is no with respect to Hadoop, because data redundancy is actually given priority here to make sure that all of your data has backups and there is a way to retrieve data in case if it is lost. So this is done by storing your data in separate clusters and actually performing various operations, which we will be checking out in the next set of questions. This brings us to question number 10. Question number 10 seems to be one of the most common and the highest probable occurrence for any question for a data engineer's interview. So it states, what are the 4 V's of big data? The 4 V's of big data involve volume, veracity, velocity, and variety. Well, this is very important that you guys know this. Volume is talking about the amount of data that you're supposed to handle. Veracity is talking about the quality of the data, how much of it is useful information, how much of it is just noise. And then when you're talking about velocity, velocity is all about the speed of arrival at which the data is coming through to the pipeline, and this will give you a clear idea of how quickly you need to process the data. And of course, variety, as the name suggests, is how different your data from each other. So basically, what are the types of data that you are seeing that you need to process here? So with volume, we're talking about the amount of data. Veracity talks about the quality of the data. Velocity talks about how quickly the data is arriving into your architecture or environment. And variety is talking about the various types of data that can be coming through various sources as well. This brings us to the next question, question number 11. What is block and block scanner in HDFS? Well, whenever you talk about a block, make sure to highlight on the aspect that it is a singular entity of data. This means that a block is the smallest entity of data when you're talking about Hadoop and storing files in Hadoop. Because Hadoop does this really nice thing. Whenever it encounters a large piece of file or a huge chunk of file, it will automatically cut it and slice it into tinier aspects. And these tinier aspects are the one we call blocks and block scanner. As the name suggests, a block scanner is actually used to see if the large amount of data which is cut into blocks is actually correct or not. So it checks if there is any loss of blocks when Hadoop goes on to split the data into multiple tiny entities. And this data, as you might have already guessed, is getting stored on the DataNode. And all the information with respect to the data gets stored in the NameNode, as we previously discussed. So all in all, the block scanner is used to just verify if there is any loss of any number of blocks whenever Hadoop goes on to split the files. Question number 12. If there are files which have been corrupted, how does Hadoop handle this? Or how does a block scanner handle corrupted files? So you need to understand that whenever there is, whenever data is stored in the data node, there are chances that a file might be corrupt. So the first couple of steps that happen whenever Hadoop realizes that through block scanner that it has seen a corrupted file is that the data node will actually report this corruption entry into the name node. The data node literally tells the name node that I have a file which is corrupted. And then what the name node does is basically it creates replicas of the file which was corrupted. And then this will give you the original file which was unaltered, which is not corrupted. And then basically the name node tells the data node back that the files have been recreated and no need to worry. And the name node eventually tells the data node again after the recreation of the original files that these files have been created. So whenever there is a match with respect to the replicas created and the actual existing files, you need to understand that the data block which was corrupted is actually not removed. So this is one important point you can always mention. Coming to question number 13. So how does the data node communicate with the name node or vice versa? There are two important ways the name node and the data node communicate with each other, and the concept is called as messages, because messages are sent in between name node and data node, and there are two types of messages called as block reports and heartbeats, which are actually exchanged, and this forms the vital channel of communication in between the data node and the name node in Hadoop. More on this in the coming set of questions. So question number 14. What is meant by COSH or COSH? Well, this is a very simple abbreviation for classification and optimization based scheduling for heterogeneous Hadoop systems. So what it basically means is that it provides very good amount of tools and methodologies required for scheduling activities which are performed at the cluster level. So this will basically ensure that all of your applications are completed on time now that they have scheduling attached to them, and it is not happening in a haphazard way. So this is the basic working of COSH. Coming to question number 15. Again, since we've already checked out schemas, this might be a follow-up question as well. So what is star schema in brief? Star schema, first of all, is also called as the star join schema. Make sure you remember that. And one of the most important things is that star schema is the simpler schema when you're comparing star and a snowflake schema as well. So in the concept of data warehousing, it is a very simple aspect of how data can be stored. And the structure, as the name suggests, resembles a star, and hence it's called as a star schema. Your fact tables in the middle and all the dimension tables surrounding it. So whenever we talk about star schema, understand that it will only be used when you're working with huge amounts of data. Of course, you can still use star schema when you're working with a small amount of data, but then it can only be put to use effectively when you're working with large amounts of data. So this question can again be asked, what is snowflake schema in brief, which could be a follower to the previous question as well. So when you're talking about snowflake schema is basically star schema version 2.0. Think of it that way, because it is an extension of star schema which has the ability to have more dimensions attached to it. So basically it is a more complex version of the star schema, and it looks like the structure of a snowflake when looked under a microscope. Hence it has the name snowflake schema. The data in the snowflake schema is very structured, and it is split into many more tables when you compare it to a star schema, which is performed basically after normalizations. This is done to make sure your data is highly readable and it is effectively stored as well. And then even after this, if the interviewer wants to push you a little bit more on the basic schemas, star and snowflake, here is a table which covers the difference between the star schema and the snowflake schema. So these 4 points are very important, because in the star schema, you'll be emphasizing on the aspect of where dimensional hierarchy is stored. And again, in the case of snowflake schema, that it is stored in every individual table out there. So hierarchy is stored in separate tables in the case of snowflake schema, but in the case of star schema, it is stored in the dimensional tables itself. Star schema involves a lot of data redundancy, while there is low data redundancy in terms of snowflake schemas, and database designing is very simple when you're working with star schemas, but it is very complex to handle a lot of data in terms of storing it and maintaining it when you're working with large scale snowflake schemas. And of course, this ensures that star schema has faster processing, while snowflake schema in some cases, due to its nature, might be a little slower in data processing activities. This brings us to the 18th question, which says, name the XML configuration files which are present in Hadoop. Do note that you do not have to explain on these XML configuration files, but then make sure that you name the files. Naming the files for this question is very important. And there are 4 main XML configurations files present in Hadoop. They are core site, MapReduce site, which basically stands for MapReduce. Then we have the HDFS site and the yarn site. So make sure you name these 4 configuration files when asked. Coming to question number 19. Question number 19 was again asking you about another very important and interesting aspect of data engineering. So the question goes, what is the meaning of FSCK? FSCK basically stands for File System Check. Make sure you remember this. File System Check is nothing but FSCK. And this is again a very important command which is used to work with when you're using the Hadoop file system. So whenever you go on to use the file check, basically it is performing a check where you're analyzing your data to see if there is any problem in the data, or see if any files are corrupted, or if you have to change anything in the data as well. So this will give the user a first-hand look into the data to see if there is anything wrong with it. And make sure to emphasize on the fact that it is very important to perform file checks, especially in the world of data engineering. This brings us to question number 20. Question number 20 states, what are some of the methods of reducer? Well, whenever you're talking about the map function or the reducer function, you need to understand that each of these entities will have sub methods involved with them. And when we're talking about the reducer, here are the three methods which are actually associated with reducer. The first thing is setup. The setup method is basically used to understand what the input data parameters are and also understand how the data is cached and the protocols which go on to cache the data as well. The second method involves cleanup. Cleanup, as the name suggests, is simply used to remove all of the cache files after its usage, or in the general removal of any temporary files as well. And then when we're talking about the reduce method, so the reduce method is where the actual reduction operation happens. So it is called one time for every key call, and this basically forms to be one of the most important method in the entire aspect and working of reducer, as the name suggests. Moving on to the next question, what are the different usage modes that Hadoop supports? Well, Hadoop basically is used in three different modes. The first mode is standalone mode. In standalone mode, the configuration files and the data can be stored on the local machine of the user itself. You do not need to have any sort of distributed architecture, client server architecture, or whatever it is. So basically all the data is stored on the local machine. Then when we talk about pseudo-distributed mode basically is the method of working where the configuration files have to be present in the local machine, but the data can be spread across a distributed system. In a fully distributed system, of course, the configuration as well as the data can be in the distributed environment overall as well. Of course, you do not have to explain on these three modes, but it is always advantageous to tell a little bit about these modes, which will basically strengthen the aspects of the interviewer, where he understands that you have put in some work and you know these modes in detail. This brings us to question number 22. Well, question number 22 basically is this: how is data security ensured in Hadoop? Whenever you're working with large amounts of data as a data engineer, you need to understand that your data has to be secure, especially in today's world. So there are three steps which are involved when you're working with data security in Hadoop. The first most important step is that you have to create a channel for data flow, and if the channel already exists, you need to secure this channel. This channel we're talking about is the entity which connects your client to the server. And second thing, after you have authenticated the channel, after you have secured the channel, the second step involves the clients making use of something called as a stamp. So this stamp is basically used and received to create something called as a service request. Now, this is done to ensure that it is the actual client who is requesting the data and not someone else in their place. And this adds legitimacy to the client, and the server can see this via the stamp. And after which basically is a very simple step where these clients make use of something called as a service ticket, and this service ticket is basically a tool which is used to authenticate the server and respond back to the client as well. So the usage of stamps and service tickets are very important in the concept of data security. Coming to question number 23, this is a fairly short question, but this is again very important that you understand this as well. So what are the default port numbers for port tracker, task tracker, and NameNode in Hadoop? Well, there are three different port numbers associated with it. The job tracker has the default port 50030, where task tracker has the default port 50060, and the NameNode has the default port 50070. So make sure you understand and remember this in however the best way you find to remember this. this. But then again, using it twice or thrice will actually help you concrete this particular port number detail into your brain, because at the end of the day, this is something which will come by practice and you will not forget it, to be honest. So coming to question number 24. Well, question number 24 is primarily concerned with respect to the revenue of the company. It states, how will big data analytics help my company increase its revenue? Well, this is a question that you can answer in multiple ways. There is no one set answer that you can have for this, but then here are some of the important things that you can say. In the world where we're driven by data, making effective use of it is basically the entity that drives between success and failure. So effective use of data is very important. And when data is used effectively, it will directly correlate to having structured growth in the company. And then with respect to big data, it is used to drive customer value, and it will ensure that your customer retention rate increases at the same time as well. And you can perform a variety of things, among which one important thing is something called as manpower forecasting, and this is basically used to understand how the human resources are being effectively put to use in the company as well. And this again will create improvised methodologies for human resource management and staffing methodologies as well. And the most important point that you can highlight on is the fact that big data analytics will bring down the production costs in a exponential way, because this is why big data has been put into use in today's world, and the analytics aspect of it is booming since its launch. Just because of this, it will make sure that the production cost will go down rapidly as well. So make sure to mention that. And at our halfway point is question number 25. Question number 25 is concerned with what a data engineer actually does in his day-to-day role. Well, a data engineer is responsible to handle the inflow of information and creation of process pipelines. So a data engineer will sit alongside a data architect to do this, which we'll be checking out in another question. And then a data engineer is responsible for maintaining the data staging areas. He's responsible for ETL data transformations, entity transformations basically. And then another very important aspect of a data engineer's role is the ability to perform data cleaning and removal of noise, removal of redundancies, or removal of anything which might not be useful in converting the raw data into useful information. Because if the data is not cleaned, it will lead to very inefficient outputs, especially when you're performing analytics. So make sure you highlight on the data cleaning aspect as well. And of course, as a data engineer, it is expected that you have the ability to create very good queries when you're working with any sort of data operations, because it will majorly involve a lot to do with data extraction and working with that as well. So coming to question number 26. So question number 26 goes like this. What are some of the technologies and skills that a data engineer should possess? The interviewer at this point of time could be asking you this question to see if you have understood the entirety of the role of a data engineer. So some of the very most important skills and technologies that a data engineer must have is, of course, starting with mathematics. The concepts of probability and linear algebra have a lot of weightage when you're applying for a data engineer's role. And you need to work with statistics, concepts of machine learning, which can again be achieved when you're working with programming languages such as Python, R, or even SAS as well. And since you're working with a lot of data handling entities, again, Hadoop forms to be a very vital aspect of a data engineer. Working with SQL and HiveQL. HiveQL is very similar to SQL, which is basically the querying language which is used by a tool called as Hive, which again we'll be checking out in the next couple of questions. So make sure to name the technologies and the skills that you think. Of course, you can add on more to this and eventually create a list of your own as well. And with that, we can come to question number 27. I just mentioned data architect a couple of questions ago. So what is the difference between a data architect and a data engineer? Well, a data architect is a person who is mainly responsible for managing all of the data that comes into the organization basically. So whenever you're talking about data entry, think of this. Data can come from Facebook, it can come from Twitter, it can come from a local storage, it can come from your cloud storage, it can come from an entirely different network, it can come from a search result or whatever it is. So when you're working with big data, the most important aspect is the variety of data and the ability of the data architect to handle the variety of the data. So a data architect is primarily concerned with the implementation of this new data into your own architecture, where it might create some conflicts as well. So how can these conflicts be cleared in a way that the pipeline is very smooth for the inflow of data? And then now the data engineer comes into picture. So basically the data engineer is primarily responsible to work with the data architect in actually setting up and establishing this pipeline. We call it the data warehousing pipeline, and it can be well put together with the help of a data architect and a data engineer. And at the end of it, this will also result in the creation of data hubs, data processing methodologies, and some of the custom protocols which are which are basically required for the working of that particular architecture as well. So this forms to be the basic difference between a data architect and a data engineer. This brings us to question number 28. So how is the distance between each of the different nodes in the distributed architecture defined whenever a person uses Hadoop? Well, make sure you explain on what nodes are and how nodes are scaled across. Whenever you think of approaching this particular answer, the nodes are kept in such a way that there is a distance between them. And with Hadoop, it makes it very easy to assess and find this distance, because it is a very simple sum of the distance between your current node and the node that you want to find the distance to. Instead of doing the calculations manually with Hadoop, as I just mentioned, it gives you the get distance method, and this method can be put to use effectively to basically calculate all of the distances. So the simplest answer to how one can find the distance between the nodes in Hadoop is to basically use the get distance method. So make sure you emphasize on that as well. But then it is always advantageous to mention the manual working of it in case if they ask, which is basically finding the sum of the distance between all of the closest corresponding nodes which exist. So with that, we come to question number 29. So question number 29 states, what is the data that is actually stored in the NameNode? As I mentioned previously, NameNode is responsible for having the data with respect to the actual data that you're working with. What I mean is, so basically this is called as metadata, where data is again describing another piece of data. So metadata information is stored in NameNode, which corresponds to all of the actual block data which is present in the DataNode. So NameNode is this descriptor file that you can consider about the actual data being present in the data nodes. And it is as simple as that. And with that, we come to question number 30. Question number 30, what is meant by rack awareness? Well, rack awareness is again a very widely used concept these days, and this question is highly probable to be asked in the interview as well. Why do I say this? Because rack awareness is something which is really nice. It is a concept in which the NameNode actually goes on to use the data node, to directly increase all of the incoming network traffic into that particular distributed architecture as well. So what it basically does is that whenever there is any read operation or any write operation that is being performed, there is a rank which is associated to each of these operations. And so whenever a read or a write operation is basically created, there is a rack which goes into that operation, be it a read operation or a write operation. So it is executed in a way where it is the closest rack to which the data access was performed through. So whenever you talk about rack awareness, so it is basically telling that Hadoop architecture makes use of this to increase your traffic by performing operations in parallel and telling Hadoop that it is doing so. So this is a very simple explanation of rack awareness. Whenever we talk about communication in Hadoop, a very common question that they can ask you is, what is meant by the heartbeat message? We already checked out that heartbeat is one of the two ways which is basically used to communicate between the NameNode and the DataNode. But then you need to understand that heartbeat is a very important signal which is sent by the DataNode. So as literally the name suggests, heartbeat is basically the DataNode telling the NameNode that it's still operational and that it is still working fine. If there is no heartbeat message sent from the DataNode to the NameNode thinks that this particular data aspect is corrupted or it isn't operational. So a heartbeat is literally used to track if the DataNode is functioning or not, and it is as simple as that. This brings us to question number 32. It states, what is the use of a context object in Hadoop? Well, a context object is used in Hadoop and it is used together with something called as the mapper class, and this combination with the mapper class and the context object basically creates a path for communication. So this is very important because in Hadoop or any distributed architecture in the field of data engineering is where data communicates with a lot of other entities. With the context object, it makes it very easy to understand what the system configuration is, what are the jobs that are supposed to be executed, and the details corresponding to the job as well. So these two form to be the very vital use of context object. But of course, you can also state that alongside these, context object is actually used to send information to certain methods. These methods can be the setup method, the map method, and even the cleanup method that we already checked out. So there is a wide variety of usage whenever one talks about context objects in Hadoop. This brings us to question number 33. Question number 33 states, what is the use of Hive in the Hadoop ecosystem? Well, as I've already mentioned before, Hive is one of the very important tools that is in the Hadoop architecture, which is basically used to provide the user with an interface. So this interface is used to handle and work with the data which is actually stored. Think of it like a database management system, but here we're talking about a distributed architecture. As I've mentioned previously, Hive query languages are very similar to the working of SQL query languages, and these are executed to be converted into the MapReduce jobs which actually perform the data manipulation there. So you actually write a query in Hive which is then converted into a MapReduce job, and in the MapReduce job the data actually gets processed. So this is how you can handle all of the complexity which comes whenever you have to work with multiple MapReduce jobs at a single time. And with respect to Hive, it gives you a user interface to simplify all of this to an exponential level. And with this, we can check out question number 34. So question number 34 states, what is the use of Metastore in Hive? Well, so Metastore is a very simple entity. It is basically used as a place where you can store your schemas and your Hive tables. That's it. So whenever you asked about Metastore, make sure you explain it in a simple way and not complicate it. It is a storage location which is used to store the schemas and the Hive tables. So what is the data that gets actually stored? The various mappings in between the data entities, the various definitions which define the relationships or even the data, and such as metadata can be stored in the Metastore as well. And of course, after all of the data is stored into the Metastore, this goes into the RDBMS or wherever it is required and then used as per the application. So with this, you can already understand that Metastore is very vital to be used when you're working with Hive. And this brings us to question number 35. What are the components that are available in the Hive data model? There are three main components which are present whenever you talk about Hive. It's basically buckets, it's tables, and it's partition. Whenever the interviewer asks this, there is no strong requirement that you have to explain on the working of the components, but then make sure that you understand and know what these components does. Because if they ask a follow-up question based on the components of Hive, you can answer them easily as well. Now coming to question number 36. Can you create more than one table for every data file? So, or it can also be asked as, is it possible to create a single table for an individual data file when you're working with Hadoop? The simple answer to this question is yes. It is more than possible to create one single table which contains data for a data file, because in Hive, as I've already mentioned in the previous question, all of the schemas get stored in the Metastore. So there's already a structured aspect to how data is mapped and stored. By making use of a single table, it even simplifies it further down rather than the already simple existing model of the Metastore. So this makes it very easy to actually go on to extract the data or extract the analytics aspect of the data whenever required as well. And with this, we come to question number 37. Question number 37 states, what is the meaning of skewed tables in Hive? This is a very, very common question whenever the interviewer asks about Hive, because skewed tables are the entities that are present in Hive where all of the columns or the rows can contain data which is very much repeated. So if your Hive table consists of a lot of numbers, let's say on a simplified example, So here the numbers are repeated a lot. So if there is a lot of repetition in the data that's present in your tables, more the skewness of the table. So a skewed table is basically a table which will have a repeated set of values present inside them. Whenever you're using Hive, the table is actually considered as skewed while creating it itself. Make sure you highlight on this point. If you already know that your table will contain repeated information, you can classify the table specifically as skewed whenever you are creating it. And basically by doing this, it ensures that all of the values can be written into separate file to avoid data redundancy, and later these files which are not redundant can go into a same file. So as I just mentioned, this is used as a structured way to approach the data and to effectively store them as well. So one important takeaway from this answer for you guys is that if the data is more repeated in the table, it is more skewed. So this term forms to be very important here. And then coming to the next question is question number 38. What are the collections that are present in Hive? So collections are nothing but the data types of Hive. So whenever you are asked about collections, understand that the interviewer is trying to ask you about the data types. So there are four main ways Hive can handle data through structured aspects. It is done using arrays. Data is handled using concept of maps. It is handled using struct and union. So again, as I've mentioned in the previous questions, if the interviewer is expecting you to explicate on this particular question, make sure to talk a little bit about all of these individual data types and where they can be best used as well. That is going to add a bit of value to your candidature as well. So coming to question number 39. What is the meaning of SIR in Hive? Well, SIR is basically a short form for serialization and deserialization. So whenever data is moved across Hive tables, we have two operations which are performed. One is the serialization operation and the other one is the deserialization operation. Whenever serialization occurs, so basically the entity which does this, it is called as a serializer. The serializer will take in all of the Java objects which comes to it. It converts it into a format which is understood by the HDFS. And after this, HDFS will actually take over completely, and it will ensure that it can be used for the appropriate storage function. So serialization is the basic conversion of the input data into a format which is understood by the HDFS. Now, deserializer is basically taking any record which is present in the HDFS and converting it back into a Java object. So this is basically done to help Hive understand what the data actually means. So again, deserializer will basically take your record and convert it back into a Java object to make sure Hive understands what the data is. After the serialization operation, Hive will not be able to understand what the data is. Hence the requirement for the deserializer. And with this, we come to question number 40. So question number 40 is concerned with what the table creation functions are that are present in Hive. Well, there are four main important table creation functions that are present in Hive. So they are the explode function when you're working with arrays, explode function of course when you're working with maps. There's the JSON_tuple function, and there is a stack function as well. So these are the four functions which are primarily used for table creation whenever you're working with Hive. So make sure you quote these four functions. And then moving on to question number 41. Question number 41 states, what is the role of the .hiverc function in Hive? It can also be called as the .hiverc file in case if the interviewer wants to separate it out and tell you, but then it's called as the hiverc file in general. So what is the role of this particular file? The first important part of your answer should be that this is used for initialization. So whenever you want to write any piece of code for Hive, right, you first open up the entity, which is of course the command line interface. And whenever the command line interface is opened, this hiverc file is the first file you have to load in case if you have to work with Hive, as I just mentioned. So what this file contains is basically all of the parameters that you will have to initially set to work with your Hive model as well. So this forms a very important aspect to tell the interviewer that it's used for initialization when you're working with Hive, and it is one of the first commands that you will put into the command line interface before working with the files as well. And why is it done? It is done to basically set all of the parameters before beginning the work in Hive. Coming to question number 42. So what are args and k-wargs whenever you're working with data engineering aspects? Well, again, this is a very simple question with a very simple answer, but then this is very much important as it is asked in most of the data engineering interviews out there. So the args function is basically, as the name suggests, is the argument function. It is used to define a set ordered function which is basically used in the command line. So let's say you have multiple functions you want to execute on the command line. The args function is basically used to define all of these ordered functions to be used in the command line interface. So coming to the kwargs function, or it's the kwargs function, is basically trying to denote that there are certain arguments that are unorganized, that are unordered, and these are used alongside as the input to a function. So your args function is to basically denote a creation of an ordered function, but your kwargs function is basically used to denote the set of arguments that are basically unordered, and these go into the function as well. So this is the simple understanding of what args and kwargs mean. And with this we come to question number 43. How can you see the structure of a database by using MySQL? Well, it is very simple. The syntax to understand and see the structure of a database is to describe the database. So to describe the database in MySQL, you have a very simple command called as describe itself, as the name suggests. So describes space table name and of course a semicolon at the end will give you important aspects of that particular table in that database when you're working with MySQL as well. So make sure to write down the syntax, and of course you can give an example as well by creating a table and show how it's described when the described table name syntax is used as well. So now question number 44 states, can you search for a specific string in a column which is present in a MySQL table? So can you search for something which is specific to the name of that column or the data in that column? Whenever there is a MySQL table is another way this question can be asked. So the simple answer to this is yes, because whenever you're working with MySQL, you can find any specific string you require, any substring, and you can perform operations on this easily by making use of the regular expression operator. So the short form of the regular expression operator is regex, and regex is basically used to do exactly this. And with this, we'll move on to question number 45. So question number 45 deals with asking you the difference between a data warehouse and a database. Well, this is a very important question. So make sure to keep this answer very concise and in an efficient manner. So let's begin. So basically, whenever we're beginning with data warehousing, it is the entire focus of data warehousing is to make use of certain functions called as aggregation functions. So aggregation functions are basically min, max, average, sum, difference, all of these functions. And these functions are used to perform certain set of calculations, and you'll be selecting some sort of data to perform processing. So this is the goal of data warehousing. Now, whenever we talk with databases is concerned with more, because here you'll be talking about how the data is input. So how the data is put into the database, how you can manipulate the data, how you can perform certain operations where you're modifying it, you're deleting it, and much more. So a database is concerned with speed and efficiency because data access, data processing, and data storage is happening right here. And then the difference is actually as simple as this, as stated. So make sure to answer this. In the concise way. Coming to question number 46. Question number 46 has a lot of weightage because this could be, in the top 3 questions that will guarantee be asked in any of the interviews. It states, have you earned any sort of certification to boost your opportunities as a data engineer? So whenever your interviewer asks you this question, he or she is trying to find out if you are really interested in the job role that you're applying for. So if you say yes to this answer, the interviewer will understand that you want to enhance and advance your career in this particular field because you've put in a lot of time, you've put in some efforts, you've learned the concepts, and you've implemented them actively. Now, it'll also give an impression that you are a strong aspirer and that you're capable of learning new things and effectively putting those to use as well. This again adds to the third point on your screen that you can see as you being an effective learner. And then One thing you can talk about it is not just what you have done in your certification, but then explain about how you have actually put it into practical use. So whenever you've learned something new, the most important aspect of it is to actually use it. So all the projects that you'll be working on in your certification programs is basically a real life project where you're solving a problem. So make sure to explain the problem that you have tried to solve and explain the approach that you have taken to solve the problem. So this is very important. And if you do not have any sort of certifications, there is absolutely nothing to worry. If you're strong with all the concepts, and if you do not have any certifications, absolutely nothing to worry. If you have it, of course, I'll give you a lot of weightage, but if you do not have it, just make sure that you understand all of the concepts thoroughly in a way that you're establishing thorough contact with respect to the interviewer and proving your worth with respect to this concept of data engineering. And this brings us to question number 47. Do you have any experience working in the same industry as ours before? Well, the answer to this is dependent on the company you're applying for, because again, it depends on that particular company's goals, aims, and what they're actually doing. So if you have any previous experience working in the same industry, make sure you answer this to the best of your abilities, and not just as a yes or no answer, but make sure to elaborate on the previous experience in case if you have had any, and with respect to all the tools, the techniques that you have actually used as well. This will actually add a lot of weightage again, because you're telling the interviewer that you've had industry level exposure to the same industry as in the company that you're applying for. And with this, we come to question number 48. Question number 48 states, why are you applying for this particular data engineer role in the company? So with this, the interviewer is trying to see if you are proficient with your subject, if you understand everything you've learned, and if you can handle all of the concepts that is required to handle the large amount of data that's present in the company. Basically, as a data engineer, you'll be helping to build a pipeline, as we have discussed, and you'll be working with the same pipeline as well. So to answer this, it is always advantageous to have a complete understanding of the job description, to understand what is the compensation that goes with respect to this particular role you're applying for, what are the details of the company, how the company works, and how you can bring the best of yourself to the company. So this last point that I mentioned, how you can bring the best of you to the company, where you explain on that, is very, very important. So answer this to the best of your ability. And again, as I mentioned, there is no one step answer to this, but then this is totally dependent on you, and here is the framework that you can actually use to answer it. This brings us to the last but not the least question number 49. What is your plan after joining this data engineering role? Well, and again, here is my advice: do not start on stories. So again, with this answer, I would like to give you an advice to make sure you keep it concise. Please do not give any long stories, as the interviewer might not have the time or the expectation to hear from you as well, to hear from you in detail about what you're planning to do, because you have not joined the company yet. So, but then it is very important that you talk about how you will put in effort to understand how the data infrastructure is set up in the company, and how you will take part in this infrastructure, either to make it better, to improvise it, and then work easily in collaboration with all of the other members of the team as well. So use this as a fine print to build your answer and then give it out in a concise way. And then make sure you do not give unorganized long answers for this particular question. And with this, we come to the last question, which is again very important if you've had experience in the field of data engineering. So the question is, do you have any prior experience working with data modeling? Again, if you're interviewing for an intermediate role, this question will always be asked for sure. It will be asked in the beginning of the interview, in fact. So make sure you answer with a yes or a no. And if you're asked this question, there is a good chance that you're applying for an intermediate level role. So do know this. There are two ways to answer this. One, if you answer no to this, you can have proficiency in all of the other data engineering concepts, but not data modeling. So if you answer no, it is completely all right. Talk about data modeling, talk about what you understand by it and how you plan to learn it if you answer no. If you answer yes, then make sure to talk about the tools that you have used to perform data modeling. There are tools like Pentaho and Informatica which are used just for data modeling. So if your answer is yes, make sure to elaborate on this particular aspect of it, and do not worry, as I just mentioned, if your answer is no to it, because you might have proficiency in some other aspects of data engineering that they're actively looking for.
So this brings us to the end of this session. If you have any queries, you can leave a comment down below. Thank you so much for watching, guys.